Hi, my name is Benedict. It's mix walkthrough time. The track is called Autumn, and it's from a fellow who calls himself Like a Fire in Nebraska. Unusual name. And yet, it seems that he comes from in Berlin, by the wall, where we can be heroes and dream of adolescent sex and juvenile intentions. Oh, sorry. Getting a little whole carried away there with the whole Hansa by the Wall thing. But yes, apparently from Berlin. If I hadn't seen that on his Bandcamp, which will be linked down below, then I would have probably assumed that he was French. There's something very French in the style of this. It came to my attention in a forum for Reason Software, where he showed that he had this EP, again, will be linked below, and he showed this particular track, which I had listened to, and I thought, I think I really like this track, but I don't like how it's coming together in the mix. Not based on technicalities, but it's one of those songs that really has to feel like it comes together. Whereas because of the choices in the mix, or the choices that led to the decisions in the mix, I think, more to the point, it felt more like it had been exploded rather than having these parts to come together. So rather than that feeling of here we've got all these things making one song, one message, I felt like we had a bit here and a bit here and a bit here, and they never really had that thread to join them together to become the one thing that they are. Let's have a quick listen. Now we've got this really, really nice sort of Days of Future Past kind of song. It's a dreamy reverie, almost like there's this guy lying in bed dreaming of this, I assume, girl that he used to know, and as though she's right there beside him, but she's not, and he's talking to her out of this, sort of halcyon days memory. That's always a charming way to approach a song. It's worked for so many people. Other Side of Life, seeing we mentioned Moody Blues, is essentially the same idea. And I think it's very well delivered, but it doesn't come together. Mix-wise, people would say, well, this mix is technically great. But let's flip back to mine.
It felt like a long lost forgotten memory. Do you think of me?
I found his voice very dislocated from the mix. It's very dry. I know dry vocals are all the rage these days, but I found it dry and dislocated. I found his whole mix too bright, too clean. Now, here's an interesting thing. He sent over his reason file, which is great. I love working in other people's reasons files when they're tidy, which this was. He'd got buses and there was a logic. Not my logic, but there was a logic to everything that was in here. But when he sent it across, he used Ozone to master, and I don't have Ozone. Not a fan. And so I got his mix as it was, minus a few bits and pieces that I don't own, but without his master, because there was no master there, because all the other stuff was turned off. And straight away I'm thinking, I like this better. So I think a lot of the hassle there was, there are some things about the mix where I think he led himself out of where he should be. But I think his attempt to master led him even further out of where he should have been, which is sad. And I think I know why that happened. Again, this is his. Mine, on the surface, his is going to seem like it should be better because it's brighter, it's wider, it's all of those things. But again, my point was, it feels like it doesn't come together as one thing. I very much mix to try to bring it together as one and to be incredibly warm. also wanted to really focus on that vocal and the dreamy nature of the sound. To me, this wasn't a track about drums. The drums are incidental, they're time keepers, they're just sort of rhythm keepers. So different approach, neither right nor wrong. So none of this is about being on a high horse, but I'd take this on to say, look, well, AB will also point out what I think caused what I think is a mix that isn't as good as it could be. Could somebody do a different mix and it be better than mine? Sure, hell yes. But is the original mix delivering the story as well as it could go? I don't think so. So, all comes down to what I think caused the issue of his mix appearing to be exploded is because he's put the attention into writing a really nice song. He's put some attention into the detail and how it comes together. There are parts which are copied and pasted and repeated, but thankfully sections like where he's got two guitars, they are two different performances, even if they are copied and pasted. Some vocals are copied and pasted to somewhere else, but the performances are good. Ideally, I'd like to see them done as fully unique, but such is the nature of the work in the door, and if I hadn't looked inside the mix, I wouldn't have stopped to question that. So it's a bit of a moot point, but just sort of saying, hey, that's how that got done. But it's been nicely done, and then I think he's gone, oh, well, I don't really know what to do next, and then has either deliberately gone out and watched a lot of tutorials online by kind of people, or has just been watching them over time and then gone, oh, well, I need to break out this part and process it exactly that way. I break out this part and process it exactly that way, and never stop to think, how does this come together as one song? It's one story. It's Jack and Jill is one story. It's not a story randomly about Jack and a story randomly about Jill, and then they both walked in the opposite direction, because there's no interaction there. There's no actual story left. So I think it was from, and this is what I thought right from the beginning, that I heard when I'm listening to it first, is that it's more from not knowing what to do and then overdoing to try to compensate. And when I was a lot younger and associating with true indie acts and bands and what have you, and they're making things on cassette 4 tracks, then, yeah, we worried about our mixes. We always did. We worried about our sound. We worried about everything. But we knew that we were not expected to deliver an Elton John mix, because we, A, had no money, and B, we didn't have Elton John's band. So it was a case of going, okay, well, that shows our parts, and that's it. And then I saw this great change come in the early 90s where suddenly it was all about, if you don't have your drums right, then your piece is garbage, which meant that people are focusing more on showing their drums or showing their proness at mixing than they were at showing their song. And I think that if Mr. Nebraska had focused more on just showing his song without any sense of trying to get clever with his mix, it probably would have come across better in the first place. Obviously, the song came across because it sold itself to me, and I hear so much that I'm just like, yeah, whatever. But this sold itself to me, but here's my try to say, hey, let's see what happens if we did that differently. So at this point, I'll shut my yap, play you my whole mix, then I will walk you through the decisions that were made to get us here.
Love to ask you so many things, but it's getting cold like way back in the days at the lake. We had nothing more to say, and I just enjoyed your company, 'cause it felt like a long lost forgotten memory. Do you think of me when the autumn seems to arrive? When the autumn seems to arrive. And after all these years, I'm still waiting for a special sign to get it right, to find the answer, to understand why everything went this way. And if you sometimes would love to go back and stay, do you think of me when the autumn seems to arrive? Do you think of me? Do you think of me when the autumn seems to arrive? Seems to arrive.
So, my mix of Autumn by Like a Fire in Nebraska. We'll now go to the second part of the program, which is the walkthrough, where I actually go through and explain all the decisions made and why. A lot of times people say do this, but they don't really explain why they did it. And I think that's the really important bit, because if you can understand why, then you can adapt that to your way, your methods, your tools, your whatever. So, again, none of this is meant to be judgmental, merely to say, okay, this is what I heard and this is what I did. This is a totally new mix, and what I would call a creative mix, as in I did not attempt to copy any of what was there. Merely heard the parts and said, okay, this is the way I feel like I want to put them together. There were some things that, as I said before, I think that his approach to mixing was based more on technicality and fear. And that came through. There was a lot of processing that was not necessary, like the drums had parallels, and there really was no need for parallel compression on this kind of drums. To me, they should be easy. It's not 909s on the dance floor, so that sort of trying to approach it that way, understand trying to resolve the difficulties that were felt, but I don't think that was the right approach. Also, there were a lot of very tight cuts with EQs, really narrow things. And I know deresonancing mixes is the coolest, most fashionable thing you can be doing at the moment. Oh, look, I de-resed my mix, and normally cut all the fun out of it in the process. But I think that kind of applying little notches everywhere is not serving the material in the most elegant way. And I was trying to make an elegant mix. In terms of the vocals, there are still some mouth noises there. Either don't drink as close to your recording or drink more water overall, not beer, not Coke, because you are ending up with clicks, and there are some clicks in the middle of some lines which I can't get rid of. and ideally you would do the whole line again. If I got it, I'd sort of go, well, do you want to do that again? Not because the performance isn't nice, but just those clicks become very apparent the more the material is worked and the more it is made to sound engaging. You're going to notice all those little tiny details. I also put more effort into reducing the breaths. Some of those breaths at the beginning, particularly some of the last lines in the lead vocal, sounded like and it was like it was snorting in breath, and it wasn't charming. The way I've processed has probably brought them up more, but I've gone back and pulled them back. It's to some personal taste. I know massive loud sucking in breaths is again super fashionable these days. I don't love it. I don't get rid of breaths altogether, but I pull them back so that they're under the performance rather than equal to or exceeding the performance. As I said, everything was really tidy. I then went through and got rid of almost every single mix decision so that I could start again and deliver what I felt was the right thing to do. Through that, I also getting a real sense of, well, what have I got in here? What are these parts doing? Some things I found confusing just for myself because I didn't really understand why we had several things called acoustic guitar, guitar atmosphere. They make sense in the end, but I had to kind of get my head around it. So where the buses were, I named them in a way that made more sense to me. That's just a good practice. Obviously, his order made sense to him, and that is great to see. There was no sort of sense of spaghetti in here. As he put everything down, it all made sense. That's basically it, put everything into order. In that process, I'm also starting to get a sense of, as I said, all the things that I've got here, and just a rough balance of how I think it would naturally come together if I were to make what's called a natural mix, as in you don't do anything but go, yeah, okay, that's kind of all right there, and that's all right there, and yep, it's a wrap, we could send that off. That's a guide mix. I think he probably would have been better if he'd tried to mix in those terms rather than trying to, I need to do a pro mix and prove how pro I am, because it just leads you up the garden path and out the gate. Next step was reverbs. Now, he already had 3 reverbs set up. Unusual to see 3 reverbs set up. I'm commonly using about 2. My first thought was like, oh, well, I'll probably throw them out too. But before I did, I had a listen to them, and they're nice. We've got a brighter plate. Good call always for vocals. Really good call almost for anything, but good call for vocals. I did brighten it up a little. This one had an EQ already applied. Again, there's that sense of cutting things out, but I didn't dislike what I heard. I just made it a little bit brighter because that's part of what plates are great for, and they give this feeling of forwardness and intimacy, especially if you're going to focus your vocals around your plate. So nice plate reverb there. The other 2, there's this, well, it's a convolution. I'm not really sure what it is, where it's come from. Sounds okay. Normally I got no truck with convolution, but it sounded good, so I left it there. Seems more hall-like, what have you. There was a reverb put in here basically cutting the low end, but it was turned off. I turned it back on because it's just prone to being very, and that just muddies everything up, and then you're trying to resolve it at the masters, and that leads to this really tilted mix. So turning that back on helps. And then this really long hall. It's very long and it's very dark. Again, I turned the EQ back on to clear the murk because it was murky. There's a lot going on down here that is just sort of filling in and go, and it wasn't helping the mix. It was going to cause us, again, as I said, to try and solve the problem down the track. Why not solve the problem at the beginning? So I had my reverb spaces. I was happy with his. I thought they collectively came nicely. His issue, as far as I'm concerned, when looking at, where's my mixer? There. So I never use the F5, 6, 7 keys except for when I do these, was that when you looked across, now he'd generally been good and more sends on the buses than on the individual tracks. But some things were sent to one reverb and not the other two. Some were sent to two reverbs but not the third one. And that definitely puts things in different places. Because if you've got the, let's say one of the guitars is going into the massive hall and the other's going into the small bright plate, you're putting them in two completely different places. Now, I know that with mixing, it is about putting things into places, but they've also got to come together. Remember I said he'd broken them out, like they'd been exploded out, but hadn't worked out how to bring them back together. So I've made sure that everything, you see my reverb sends, 1, 2, 3, everything goes into all three of them. I've got this rough sensor balance. Sometimes I do the reverbs before I do the rough sensor balance. Sometimes I do them all at once. Sometimes I got the balance and then I start to apply the reverb. And so I'm balancing my reverb for where I feel like these things want to sit in the space. But one space, not exploded things sort of not connected. There's one space, but we want some things to be a bit more forward, some things to be a bit more back. See how my hand changes context here as it goes forward and back to the camera? So the vocal was where I started, lead vocal here, said, okay, we're going to have a little bit more of the plate, a little bit less of the convolution, whatever that is. I think it's a hall. And then, noticeably less of the big-ass hall. From there, I then said, okay, well, what are the other parts that I want to, and how do I want to balance them up? So everything has got some kind of balance of those three reverbs, which means that everything is now very much in the same space. Even though I've moved something back, there is still that sense of connect my fingers, that these things are connected to each other rather than being unconnected. Nice reverb spaces work well together because they each have a, shall we say, strength, and where you've got multiple reverbs like that, I know these are all the same device, but the fact that one of them is a convolution probably helps make it seem a little different. We end up with a very, very rich sound. I'm all for the very, very rich sound. So once I'd got that sense of laid out, I then started to work on these vocals. I will show things more in solo here, but in reality what I do is I go through and I'd actually separated out these extra buses. They're just like a leveling type thing for the mix, and oddly enough, I forgot to turn these guys back up. So they are very low, but the mix, as far as I'm concerned, balances. So they're just left where they are. They are not affecting anything other than they're acting like what people call VCAs. So then the mix is not going to change in any negative sort of a way. Because my reverb sends are all on buses, and these are all buses, as in they are being fed by buses, then this is just turning down pre-sends and everything. So it's just interesting that I came to the end and was like, ooh, they're a bit low, but the mix works. So I'd use these to turn basically the whole mix down and keep my my vocal, turn the mix down, keep my vocal clear and forward. That way I can still hear what's happening, but I've got my, what they call solo in place here. We've got our vocal. Let's just make sure that we've got where the vocal is. Hello. Normally I've got several screens. Let's just lock him into here.
And after all these years, I'm still waiting.
In fact, we can get rid of
for
that.
A special sign to get it right, to find the answer, to understand what.
Now you can probably hear some bleed in there. This happens, but if you're singing and you've got your headphones extremely loud, you're going to push bleed into here, which can create some difficulties with your mix later, because you can hear these ticks and they don't necessarily sound like the track. I know I had to do a mix once where it was a massive amount of bleed, very bright, very tinny, very hard bleed. Must have ghastly headphones or awful hearing. After he finished this, he would have. I ended up having to change the whole sound of the mix to deal with his bleed, because he had sent me a backing track, and his vocal with this massive amount of bleed, and it defined how I mixed the whole track. This isn't terrible, but try very much to have closed cans, turn the volume down in them. Turn up your own fallback if you need, but don't be so loud that your microphone's actually going to hear you here. There were times where I felt like the microphone was a little funny. Don't care what a microphone is. Felt very full, so maybe you're a little too, close to the microphone. It was very, very full. But it also had a lot around the kind of the 1K. It was a little hard. So if I were to guess, I would say it's a condensation mic that somebody's pulled right up to here. God forbid they've held it like this, like a face hugger. Condensers, yeah, technically are better, but they're not always the most flattering in the sense that they can bring out a lot of paperiness or cardboardiness in vocal if you are not very careful. And I would say if that's what you've done, used your condenser and held it right up here, is back off. That way you'll get a more natural, pleasant sounding vocal that doesn't require as much EQ. I can see you'd struggled with the EQ the whole way through, trying to cut out all this body. There's other ways, there's better ways. So we've got our vocal, and that's good. I like it. So if we
and after all these
start
years,
processing,
I'm still waiting.
We've obviously got our reverb. We're going to leave that in
for a special sign to get it right.
First thing is
to find the answer.
Compressor.
To understand why everything went this way.
Now, I've in many ways compressed a little harder than I normally would. And I wanted this feel. I actually heard somebody else doing this and talking about this with a female country singer. And as he's talking about it, I was thinking, yeah, I don't think I agree with you. But then, while I didn't like the song, it was a bit too modern for my taste, a little bit too hipster, trying to suck in all her breaths and what have you. As he said, he wanted to make it sound like the microphone was down her throat, so he compressed hard. As soon as I hit this, I thought, that kind of matches what that guy was talking about. So I've compressed a little harder than I normally would, and bearing in mind I'd normally only have 1 or 2 dB of compression, and here I'm talking about maybe 3 or 4 dB. It's pretty small. He was running at sort of about 7 dB of compression. So I've slowed down my attack to make sure everything can come through. So you hear the beginning of the line, especially the beginning of this very first line.
I would love to ask you.
So if we overdo this,
I would love to ask you,
which is what he was doing, and then turning the whole thing up, it actually moves really nice. It was like, I would love to ask you. So it kind of pushes forward. And I liked what he was talking about, what he was trying to achieve. I didn't love the result because I didn't love the song, but the idea was very, very interesting to do. So very short release, but it's just kind of pushing forward, but a long attack, or long-ish attack here, to make sure that all the transients, all the beginning of that voice gets through, so it creates this kind of push and pull feel as he comes on and off.
And after all these years, I'm still waiting.
If I was chasing a modern mix, which I honestly never am, then I would have pushed harder. Whether that be a stronger ratio or just a harder threshold. Using the drive here full to really
for a special
him forward.
Sign to get it right, to find the answer.
Yeah, that really adds a lot of sparkle and movement and interest in the voice as we push that drive on. I don't care even if I'm going to hear little instances of drive. It's the sparkle that we want in that vocal. So I'm going to be very careful with what I get rid of. Now, he'd used Salig's de-esser, which I'm not going to say is a bad thing. I have used it. I don't like de-essing. I am pretty anti-de-essing. I'd rather de-de-ess. But I have used this doohickey, which I've started using recently. I feel like I get the right results. The problem I have with selling this device is not that it doesn't do its job, it's just that I can't seem to work out how it does its job. I've read the manual several times and still feel like I walk away mystified. Sorry, guys. I think it's probably a great tool because all your tools are great, but it just somehow I'm not getting what it does and how and why it does it. This one works out of the box, but it does have this cool ability to filter. So you can basically solo the band and hear, and you can listen to the band and go, yeah, that's probably the most intrusive there. Leave that there and go forward. So only 3 to 4 tops dB in terms of de-essing, and I'd already decided I was happy to keep this vocal a little bit warmer, in which case, yep, right up tippy top is where I was going to say, yeah, if we're going to de-ess, let's de-ess up there. I'm happy to have a lot of sibilants and because they're the hooks that grab onto you, and if you smooth them off too much, you end up with a vocal that might as well just be ooh the whole way through. Not my policy. And then echo. Now the echo came in later. I added this once I'd put all the vocals together, so I sat back and listened to the vocals and they interact together, and it's like, ooh, when that one verse comes in, it's just too dry. And it's like, oh, I love my reverbs and I love my delays. It's, I guess, part of my style. It's part of my thing. I don't do it because it's my thing. I do it because I'm driven to do it. And I thought, look, this needs something. And I think it really works.
Sometimes would love to go back.
I know there's that sort of right up too close sound is really in these days, but it's uncomfortable. It's not beautiful. This needs to be beautiful. This is a reverie, and we're supposed to remember the beauty of those moments, you know. And if the vocal's a little bit creepy, like Axe Murderer, then it's not doing its job. So a very short delay. I've really just went straight to the 90, ended up at 95, because I was thinking, well, okay, is this really a 60 or a 120 kind of a situation? Put it right in the middle, and it just felt right away. Now, there's initially a pretty low mix, but then I started to push the mix a little bit more, and then there's a thing that gets done. So most of the time it's like this.
I would love to ask you so many things, but it's getting cold.
We've still got that sense of intimacy, but there is a dream in here. But as this line goes, it kind of rises and it kind of moves to a sense of outside of this world, because he's starting to ask for what is not there, what is not possible.
To understand why everything went this way. And if you sometimes would love to go back and stay.
So I have turned that slapback into a kind of reverb, and it moves him back and out. And that has that sense of, ooh, our world is bigger. Our world is unbounded in imagination. In imagination, he can still, as I said before, have this girl right here, lying next to him in bed, her face like right here. It's not possible in reality, otherwise he wouldn't be singing this song. He'd just be, you know. So therefore it's a fantasy, and I've lifted that to really try and drive that through. You probably won't hear it or notice it. Yeah, of course you'll hear it, but you probably won't notice it consciously, but it's just that feeling of expanding, because as we go forward, we're going to have even more backing vocals, and they need to be big. So a little bit of automation there to really move him and tie him into the backing vocals. Lead vocal, done. We've now got kind of two sets of backing vocals. We've got these, which are a sort of a call and response. Let's just put them there. Solo.
when the autumn seems to arrive.
Now that's a backing to the main part, which is he's singing the same thing here, and then this.
Ooh, do you think of me? Ooh, do you think of me? When the autumn seems to arrive.
So it's a call and response as, ooh, do you think of me when the autumn seems to arrive? Lovely, lovely stuff. Very, very nice. I'm sure he's French. He's got to be French. I mean, Germans are singing about the robots. This is French. That's really nice. And I deliberately decided I wanted these to be really big and really broad. So I've kept his lead down the middle as expected. These backing vocal parts here, let's just give ourselves the most amount of space that we can. It's these ones here. Now, if you look inside, you'll see I have not done any processing on any individual track here. Oh, sorry, I forgot. I ought to step back just for a moment because I didn't have my F2 window on. It's so hard to put everything into the one screen here. Yeah. So let's go back to my main vocal here. My main vocal.
Why everything when...
Now he'd been doing a lot to try and pull back here. Yes, it's thick. Yes, it's a bit problematic. He'd got his high pass too high. I know you were trying to get rid of the, but don't go too high. Anything much above 80 on a male vocal is probably going to make it start to sound thin and ungrounded. And we don't want ungrounded because otherwise you start to sound a little bit like an insane balloon. This is not the whole idea. We should want to feel grounded in your story, in your fantasy. Even though it's unreal, we should want to feel grounded in it. Like when you watch Star Trek, it's weird science. But we feel grounded in it because it's well done. So dropping that high pass a little bit to allow more body to come through, but I've then finessed with this low shelf to just pull that back a little bit. And you notice that my cuts are reasonably broad. My cuts and boosts are fairly broad. None of this sort of pointy stuff. There are times you have to do pointy. You've got a 60 hertz arm, pointy. But if you've got several pointies, then you're probably doing more damage than good. You think, oh, well, I'm preserving all the natural except for that bit. No, except that that's the overall move in broad strokes. If I've really got an issue, then I will put another EQ in, as you had done, and deal with it there. But I will try and deal with anything first with my mix EQ, which is this fella built into the SSL and from here. Initially, I thought, oh, yeah, I'll go your direction and pull this through. But then when I listened later, I thought, oh, my God, that just sounds papery. There was too much here, which, as I said, the mic is prone to, or something's happened, prone to being too full here and then kind of papery here. So just redid this, pulling that out, the papery stuff, and then still giving the brightness, but actually rolling off the
this
top
way.
here.
And if you sometimes would love...
While I am prone to having very bright vocals to keep them very forward, I wanted this mix to feel really warm. If it's too bright, it's great for pop and rock. But for this, which is a minimal sort of a mix and it focusing around this vocal, I wanted it to feel really warm. So I let that stuff go. I've boosted here in the low air, and that brings forward the intimacy and the brightness and the sparkle of the voice. But above that, I've said, let's let that start to leave the building. All right, back to backing vocals. Nothing was done to any of these individual tracks. Not at all, not touched. See, no EQ on them whatsoever. Then we've got we'll turn that off. We've got the vocals themselves here.
To go back when the autumn seems to arrive. Ooh.
Now you can hear clicks and pops, and I don't know whether they're a vocal thing, a mic thing, or whether they are just bleed. They're probably bleed. They don't seem to stick out once we got into the mix.
Who do you think of me?
Now,
Who do you think of me?
better when I turn it on.
When the autumn seems to arrive.
I've gone even longer on the attack of this. I want all of that beginning to come through. And you might be like, well, wouldn't you be more brutal on the backing vocals? Yeah, commonly I would, but not here. I don't want to be, not in this instance, because they're a call and response. They're integral to the song. So I've decided, let's go very slow on the attack and reasonably slow on the release. I was looking for that feeling of having them move in rhythm. That's what I'm doing here with this compression, not really controlling levels, controlling the dynamic shape of them. So I'm ADSRing them.
Who do you?
I did back off the drive because they were prone to just going splatsville, and I wanted them to come across quite clear, but they don't need to be as vibrant as the lead vocal. The last thing you want to do is have your backing vocals more vibrant than your lead vocal, because then your song feels upside down. So by backing off that drive, not only do I solve the splatsville problem, but I also allow these to feel very natural, which is what I want them to do. I want them to seem so incredibly natural, like they've not been processed at all, except for what I'm about to do to them. That gives a sense of intimacy that heavily processed material just loses. You OTT something, zero intimacy, or creepy intimacy. And then the echo. This is one of my own creation. 2 different times. I set the time with them tied together and then said, okay, well, what's the division on the other side that I want to have? The first thing I tried was just to double it to 6.6, so 660 milliseconds, and it worked, but it ping-ponged, and I don't want ping-pong delay. It's just like, too obvious. So what if I halve that? So what's half of 3 is 15, and do the math, and should have been 4,950. If I got my math wrong, don't really care.
Think of me.
So
Who do you think of me?
but it then creates a kind of a syncopation, which feels natural. The feedback is between straight feedback and feedback which is actually using a feedback path, therefore there's latency inside it, and it's also pulling in the tone controls as a result. So in this feedback path, it actually gets later every single time. So it's a combination of 2 types of feedback to really, once we've established those 2 taps, to really put them into each other's space. So it starts to diffuse or reverbify. Fairly tight tone control, and then modulation in stereo here, because I want that to become as mixed up as possible, and I want that to be quite rich and full.
Do you think of me when the autumn seems to arrive?
Because I want those to definitely be behind. They're full and rich, but they've got to be behind our main vocal. So the pair of them together, where they're singing at the same time.
Autumn seems to arrive. Who do you think of me? Who do you think of me when the autumn seems to arrive?
They come across as one. Remember, it's always about making this seem as one, but there's still, you've got your main vocal, and then you've got that pair of call and response vocals behind. And because of the way it's set up with the stereo, we've got a lot of stereo happening in there. But it's a natural stereo. It's not a let's hard pan everything left, right, and end up with this kind of nothing's connected to anything. Vocals here, their EQ.
Who do you think of of me.
See, we don't want that, so let's just get rid of it. But again, not going to be too aggressive to get rid of everything. There's not a lot of bass happening in here. This is not a drum and bass thing with a sub that's playing down in this vicinity, so we can allow some natural bottom end to go out that way because it helps it feel more natural and more intimate. Our EQ, I have pulled some of this because it's a bit problematic, and because it's a backing vocal, we're looking for presence, and that's more in the highs, but I do not want to push this to compete with that lead vocal. So just a little bit, and there's actually actually no, there isn't a cut. I thought it was a tiny cut. It's not uncommon for me to provide a tiny cut on the top end of backing vocals. And again, with the low pass filter.
Do you think of me?
Then we've got these harmonies. I like harmonies. I do a lot of vocal mixing. I love vocal mixing, and when you've got nice harmonies and your vocal parts are well thought out, there is nothing quite like it. Ooh. Nice. These may well have been performed once and copied and pasted, but it works. So we've got one pair. Oh, again, zero processing on any of these. I'm going to process these as a bus, as a gang. So there's one pair there. That's the main ones. There are then these ones, which are low. You've got to be a bit careful where you've got a low harmony. They can sound very kooky, very strange. So you've got to find that point where you pull them back until they seem to balance right, which seems to be there. And then we've got this one here, which appears right at the end. Doo-doo, cool. They're a little funny. They're a little shy of pitch, but within the group, they just add a nice kind of thing. This then goes to the bus where EQ, similar sort of thing, where we've taken, we'll bypass that for the moment, we've rolled off a lot of this low because this one, and it's similar to what the original choice was, we want to really pull up the air of that, you know, the sort of DX7 of this vocal part. And I wanted it to keep going back in the mix, and I also wanted it to feel behind, so they're all good reasons to reduce this so that we've got a tilt to allow the presence to come forward, because if we just go, oh, we'll keep all the bass and then we'll turn the treble right up, we'll end up with very hard and pleasant sounding treble, and it won't sound like a DX7, it'll sound like a Casio, a bad Casio, not a CZ. I love my CZ. So it'll be poor, so we're unmasking by creating a kind of a tilt. There is that sort of papery thing, again, just pulled it back, but I'm not pulling it back like going, oh yes, I've got to be very aggressive. No, 1 or 2 dB is often absolutely plenty in mixing. It's just these little tiny movements, like the difference between one synthesizer and another in this massive, well, they sound massively different, they've got such a different sound character, is sometimes less than a dB somewhere in a broad curve in the EQ. So getting aggressive with pointies is probably unwise, because it doesn't reflect how things work in the real world. The difference between two people's voices, you put them on a spectrum and they both sort of seem to be the same. If you do some kind of A-B comparison and see what's left, then you'll go, oh, look, they're like, you know, they've got a little bit more of a dB of something here at that frequency range. It's that small, and you move small to get those pluses and minuses in what you want. But I have moved pretty hard up in the top end here, because otherwise we end up with an O-based ooh rather than getting that R-based ooh. So like I said, it says the sort of the DX7 voice rather than the sine wave voice. Big thing that's been done here is this guy. Again, one of mine, if you haven't heard me talk about it before, we've got 2 delays, which is our main pair here. We can tie them, but they're not tied. They're set to 2 different times. Where we've had the second one going late to the right, I've said, let's have the second one late to the left. So as you see, the right one is a little earlier than the left, so it bounces right, then left. Otherwise, we end up with a mix that's always travelling over here. So one of them's travelling that way, the other's travelling that way. Ooh, stereo, without hard panning things and getting them disconnected. This also has the ability that the right delay can be offset in time. So every time it comes to do a repeat, it can be actually moving either out or in. In this case, it's moving out. So its first instance on the right channel is, it's earlier, and then it gradually moves back in time, each tap or each iteration, and then goes into 3 more delay lines. The diffusion knob simply sets the time as a mathematical variance of the combination of the initial left and right. So they can be very close to being right in the center, or add on diffuse, they are literally, one would be the left, one would be the right, and the middle one would be in the middle. But it's somewhere in the middle you'll find that they actually fill in the gaps between the two main delays, and then the right kind of modulation to bring us this fat sound. Hear how it's quite a late delay, so it puts a lot of space and size in there and moves those guys back.
Do you think of me?
The song starts with these. We don't want them to be forward. They need to be right back and settled inside. They are always backing vocals. So very, very rich set of vocals now. Now we've got that, we could take our vocals and just solo those. Let's find both the vocals.
And after all these years, I'm still waiting for a sometimes would love to go back and stay.
Yeah, they'll seem a little echoey, especially there because we've got that ramp happening. But it sounds great on its own, and that's always where I start. If that sounds great on its own, now I'm going to fit all the parts around it. So vocals done, and then going, well, what am I going to choose as my spindle instrument, as in the instrument that everything's going to fit around along with the vocals. So vocals are our main spindle, never get in the way of the vocals. Then I will choose, well, okay, is this a piano piece? Is this a guitar piece? Is this a didgeridoo piece? Whatever it is, I will pick an instrument and say, okay, this is going to be my spindle, and I will start there. I debated with the piano, but I think probably it was more these acoustic guitars. You hear them. Now, they ended up quite dropped in the mix because, well, quite honestly, they don't need to be loud. Even though they're the spindle, and you might think, well, they need to be louder and everything else. No, they've just got that movement. And acoustic guitars are quite tricky to mix. I'm not the only one to say that, especially when they've got a slightly funny sound to start with. So let's go 6. Get ourselves back here. So acoustic guitars are that one there. To move them out of the way. So here we go. Acoustic guitar, left. They suffer like a lot of acoustic guitars in front of mics, especially if they're not a great pairing of guitar to mic, and there's nothing wrong with that. Doesn't need you need to run out and buy new mics and new guitars. That's stupid. If you happen to have 47 guitars and 300 microphones, then you can spend the next 87 years working out the best combination before you write another song. And yes, that's a really stupid plan. So we have what we have. We could say, oh, well, that's natural. But it's kind of muddy and lacking in sparkle. Now, the attempts to solve that, but I felt like it over EQ'd. I'm very cautious with how much EQ I use unless I'm being super aggressive. So I'll do smallish moves until I do stupid moves. I do very little in between. And this was one of those ones where, yeah, you can try and pull out lots of low end and put lots of treble on it, but then you make your guitar sound warped. And it just doesn't pan out. Mixing my metaphors there quite a lot. So the question was, well, what do I want these guitars to do? And that is movement. I still want them to seem acoustic, but I also want them to be fairly bright and forward. Their natural sound tends to be, well, typical acoustic guitar, which is kind of woody and low. The problem is, if there is a bass in this, or anybody wants to listen to it without feeling like, then we've got to work out how to thin it. And rather than EQ, or as well as EQ, I decided, okay, the best way to go will be, we'll put some EQ on the bus once we're done, but I would set up this sound here. So I put it through a tube with very little happening. Scream has this, I don't know what happens, maybe it's a tube thing, but this knob here, the further it goes to the left, the more it rolls off the low end. How it's doing it, I'm not sure, but I would rather use that than a straight EQ. I've also gone with a fairly asymmetric amount of type of drive, but there's very little drive happening here. So this is what we might call a very clean tube type situation, but it's a tube that tends to roll off a lot of the low end. Good, solving my problem for me. Now, blow me down when I do that if it doesn't start to remind me of some of the guitars on Bowie's Ziggy Stardust. Now, it's not like I'm going to suddenly say, oh, I'm going to turn this into Ziggy Stardust, because I am not. But it's like, okay, that's a nice sound. I'm liking what I hear in this. So I'll work out how to make the most of that without losing the sense that they are acoustic guitars. So that done, I then go to the other one. Very similar approach. Thankfully, 2 different performances. Brilliant. Slightly different knob positions, similar but slightly different. Still using the tube. Didn't end up using the cut on this one, or the EQ section on this one. Maybe I coulda, maybe I shoulda, who knows. But I want them to come across as different. Now, while with that on, it's like, oh, we've got more clarity with it over there. It's also intrusive. That's why I didn't use it. So we don't want these guitars to intrude. We want them to be a foundation, a spindle. And then I didn't have that EQ there. You'll see that I've got a slight broad cut on both of them, just because the tube is prone to bringing up a lot of that stuff in the middle, so it can get papery. So I've just relaxed it, only a bit. Not a case of going, oh, let's take off 18 dB. No, just a little bit. It's only, well, that's almost 2 dB. So we still have a natural sound rather than a warped and twisted and fraught sound that we end up with as a result of too much processing. Too much processing, it's a fraught or a damaged or an unhappy sound. It's tortured. We don't want tortured here. This is not 9 Inch Nails. Here we've still got that fullness, and while that's nice, the thing is we've got to compete with a mix that's got other stuff happening there. So the question then is, well, what's the important thing? What's it going to do? So I've progressively pulled this back little bit by little bit. That's always been a little bit of a problem issue for me here. That's about as pointy a cut that I will get for surgical work unless I'm absolutely hacking and slashing. And boosting here in the 3Ks to really get those strings coming through, but also rolled off the high highs. While it's very tempting to make it sounds quite unnatural, and we don't want that. We just don't want that. I want this to sit comfortably inside the mix. People will notice it, people will feel it, but they won't necessarily be going, oh, listen to that lead acoustic guitar, because we've got a lead vocalist, and he is the star of this show. In terms of what is done in processing, interesting. Looks a little complex, but this is one of the great advantages of working in Reason. It's so easy to set these sorts of things up. So I've used my Echo Nest again, very short times here, very short times indeed. And this is as a send effect. So hence this, I've got the send and it's coming back in as a return, but it is going through this EQ first. So I'm very much EQing the sound that we are hearing in terms of that delay. Sounds terrible, but it's to fill and to highlight something in those guitars, which is what you hear. I want to highlight those things, not the hiss. We won't hear that. But a little bit of hiss is wonderful in a mix. It adds a sense of togetherness. It's really cool. That's why I rarely put gates on things. If there's terrible hiss, we might have to gate it. But if there's just nice, natural, normal room and component sound, I'm going to leave it in there because it's going to sound really, really nice in the end. It's going to just help glue the whole mix together. But this has got a brightness. We've really, as I said, gone into hack and slash territory, rolled off some of the lows, but hack and slash territory here at the 3.5, and then again aggressive at the 10K. So we've really brightened the whole thing up, and that's doing what I'm not prepared to do on the main EQ, and then we're mixing a little bit of it in. And you'll very ever so subtly hear the sense that those guitars lift, get brighter, get glossier, get sparklier, because those little delays actually become like a little reverb and they add sparkle. We haven't got a lot of feedback here. We just want one or two little echoes. Ding, 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 ding. And they're bright, so they lift without really affecting the tone of the original instrument, but change our perception of the tone of it, as well as making them seem stardusty. Brilliant. Acoustics done. They are hard work. We then got these atmosphere guitars. Odd name, but they do then make sense when you listen to them. Atmosphere, that's here. Where is it? See, they go backwards. There are a couple of parts in here that just go backwards. And that could be a really dumb choice or a really good choice. Depending upon how it's handled in the mix, I think it's a really good choice in this case, in the sense that they add a mystery. I've tried to very much keep them in the mix that most people won't notice that they're there. But when they're there doing something unusual, it's like, oh, that's a guitar, but the brain knows that there's something odd about that. It going backwards adds a sense of mystery. So they're an electric, or a pair of electrics. Again, nothing done to them individually. Odd. But I'm going to actually amp them as a pair. They are panned out a little. Oh, I didn't talk about panning with vocals. I should have, sorry. It's trying to jam in so much so fast, which means I end up missing things. So the thinks left and rights, they were put at 35 each side and then 50 each side to really get them. They're the most stereo thing in the whole mix. Those the whole set, but particularly the R's. They are the widest thing in the thing. We've got a little bit of panning here, more panning for the main vocal harmony, 30-30. We're keeping the low harmony closer because it's a bassier sound. We don't want them out there where they're just going to sound freaky. And then 20-20. So split the difference between the two for that unusual last bit. They just fill in. So we've got here and here, and then they're coming in the middle. Back to our guitars, the atmosphere. So nothing done to them individually at all. I did roll off some of the lows just with our filter, just so that I'm not putting that into the drive unit. I could put that into the drive unit, but then it's going to make the drive unit deal with those as well, and I'd rather the drive unit wasn't dealing with them. It's a check which is going to sound better sort of a situation, because I will hack it off on the way out. While they are pretty sounds on their own and working very nicely with the reverb balance that's given, which is a lot of that uber long reverb, it's entirely possible they're not going to cut very nicely.
I would love to ask you so many things, but it's it felt like a...
Fair enough, there's probably a level difference here, but you can hear that without the amping, they kind of lack character, they lack cut, and then you can try and put that in with EQ and cause a lot of issues. So again, rather than going to EQ to solve my problem, I'm going to, well, let's add some character. And the great thing about overdrive in particular, but tube will do it too, but particularly overdrive, is that it tends to bring up all the little bits. So if there's some character in there that's not been picked up super well by the mic or the DI or the whatever, then putting it into overdrive will just lift that. It also has either great or super annoying feature in the Scream of dumping a lot of the low end. More often than not, that's actually a good thing. If you want it back, then you can just boost it here or EQ it back in. But I kind of like that it's prone to dumping the low end. Most of that stuff you don't really want anyway.
Long lost, forgotten.
So adding level, but it's adding this little bite to the sound, which helps propel it through. We put a little bit of the low end back in because I don't want them to be disappearing in terms of the low end. They are a background sound, so they should seem like they're kind of on the edge of the forest, not right up in front of you. You know, this is not Slash. You know, this is the Edge on Mogadon. You know, it's right back there. I ended up in a sort of a should I do this or should I do that? So between turning this off entirely or having a bit more boost. So it's like, okay, seeing I like both and I can make an argument for both, make the decision, put those settings right in the middle. Happy enough. Everyone wins, especially me. And putting it through the body, which is like a guitar cab. I prefer this body process to cab IRs. I always say it, but I find them really... but I like this. It's a thing. It's a Benedict thing. And that gives us a nice character, but I've also done the classic 50s, 60s guitarist thing of pushing my pushing my echoes through the drive. I'm going to have it here after. But it's nicer before. Remember, overdrive pulls things up. This pulls that up and is actually riding the balance between the two. As the main signal is stronger, it will actually push the echoes down. As the main signal gets weaker, the echoes will rise. So you've got this constantly moving balance, as well as that nice sort of Fender Tweed kind of feel coming out of this. No tempo sync on delay. As always, I find the point where it feels nice to me. So when I start working, I'll have this up close to 50-50, or sometimes even totally 100%, to see how it syncopates with the rest of the piece. So I'm only hearing the out-of-date echo and see how it syncopates with the rest of the piece. If it feels nice, cool. I'll then find a balance. And if this is not an actual beat division, I couldn't give a flying banana peel, because the whole idea is that it should feel nice. It should roll. Guitarists back then just said, okay, that's my echo time. That's my echo time. It's not like the Shads said, oh, I better change my echo time before I can play the next song. No, old Hanky just set his echo time. That was the Hank Marvin sound. And everything worked around it. And we didn't spend our time going, Hank, you don't know what you're doing because you haven't BPM synced your delay. No, it just wasn't done that way. So this gives that nice, authentic 60s kind of feel to it. We've got LFO amount. Now, if I recall correctly, these ones were narrowed down. Where are we? Atmosphere. Actually, no, those ones stayed in stereo sync because I'm processing the whole thing. It was these other ones, the electric switch we're going to do next, which I actually narrowed down because I didn't want them. I wanted to be able to focus them. It's really super important to be able to focus things. So we've got these two guitars going into one amplifier. Makes them belong together and also pushes them nicely to where they belong in the mix, on the edge of the forest. And then our last guitars, which were the ones in the middle, called guitar, these I put the most processing into and nothing but some EQ, which did get a little on the aggressive side for me on the end. So we've got, where are they? They're right on the end. They don't appear to the end of the piece. Where are they? There. Couple of electric guitars. Just pick this first guy. Might be nice if you used the whammy bar, or just, move the instrument just to give ourselves a little bit of, he's not doing the whole string bend vibrato, and that's fine. I don't think he needs to or should as such in the situation, but just a little bit of that organic movement, which oddly enough I notice a lot of guitarists don't do anymore. It used to be you'd see someone play a note and it'd be like on the guitar, changing the whole feel of the guitar, but now you see people just like, it might as well just like be MIDI. But such is the style of the time. But I wanted movement in these. So the first thing was chorus. I don't want it to be super obvious. I started with super obvious, but I don't want it to be too obvious. But it'll come through. And then this echo, again, echo before drive. Hear how it creates a syncopating tappings. It did have the issue, this, and particularly as we get into this drive, did have the issue of bringing the string slides up. And that became an issue, and that's why we've got the aggressive EQing at the end, that it was like, okay, I've got these and they sound super, then put it all together, doing the final balance, and it's like, those backing vocals sound distorted. Why is that? They were not distorted. Check the vocals, no, not distorted. Process of elimination of muting things until the distortion goes away, and it was actually just the string slide noises that are amplified, and then that's why we've pulled out a lot of that, mids in the centre. So just not to get rid of them, because I reckon they're great. It's just they were interacting with the oohs and making them sound like they were, which is just not as charming as ooh. And again, just that little bit of overdrive. I almost went distortion on this, but the overdrive was a nice sound. I didn't bother with a guitar speaker or whatever. I thought it sounded nice as it is. These sounds are designed to sit in the background. And then this fella here, which obviously needed a relatively similar treatment. No point my going one way and then bringing in Def Leppard's guitar rig for this one would be kind of silly. These are a pair of performances. They seem to be different performances, but they're the same material. So the approach was to say, okay, with this one, I'd use chorus here, so I would use flanger on this one. Same basic process, but different sound, different feel. As I said before, I did narrow their stereo down a bit. I didn't want them to be too wide. I want each to have a location here and here, rather than being... They come together in the mix. Reverb ties them together, but it gives you that sense of the spread guitars without that ridiculous two unrelated guitars, one out on one side of the world, one out on the other side of the world, or in orbit, which I hear too often. Guitars in orbit, yeah, great plan. So, flange. That echo, I took the numbers from the first one and just moved them slightly. So we've still got that really quite nice, clean-ish electric tone. A little bit of burr, but we've got the movement of the flanger. Put the two together with their bands in which they're operating in the stereo field. We've got this focused, as in not out there, but focused, but nice sense of a pair of these things. And they sit in the background really nicely. You will be aware of them if you're listening for them. Like if I listened to this and heard it, then I would be like, oh, I'm waiting for them guitars to come in. They are nice.
When the autumn seems to arrive, do you think of me?
They're there. Their role is to support what's happening. They're adding an extra layer of movement in this last chorus. And as I said, this needed to be hacked out just because those string slides were interfering with the vocal. It sounded like the vocal was distorting, but it was actually just that they were there. The two of them were well connected. It's great when you've got one sound appearing to make another sound distort, then you know you've got your material pretty nicely connected, but we just had to disconnect that bit. Piano. I was tempted to make it piano from the beginning because we've got it here. It's a radical piano. Don't care what anybody says. I think radical piano works very nicely in the mix. It's a nice sort of honest sound. It's not an overblown, here, look, I'm the best samples ever. Aren't you impressed that I bought this? It's just kind of a nice, honest sounding piano. Why it's called radical, I don't know, because it's not very radical at all. Maybe just because their sampling method or something, who knows. Who cares? It's quite a nice thing. There was some compression and the width had been pulled right down, which is actually really good. That was a good call to pull your width down because it sounds more natural than that whole uber stereo recording method. But I did embiggen that a little bit, simply because I wanted a bit more space with this instrument, but not out to full or all the way out. I got rid of your compression because I applied my own, and then found a nice balance with the ambience. Initially I thought, oh, well, get rid of that reverb on there because I got my own, but no, that's actually part of the sound of that instrument. So it's like, okay, it does have this cabinet or room space around it, and so it needs to be there. Wanted that to seem as natural as possible, as though it were a piano of some kind grandly sitting there in the corner of the room. So this guy, again, very soft on what it's doing. Very, very little of anything, but a little bit of drive. One stage I had a bit too much drive. Not that I had a problem with it, but when I popped it in cans, it was like, ooh, I can hear that piano's a little furry. It could become a problem somewhere else. It wasn't a problem in the lounge room, probably wouldn't be a problem for anyone on speakers, but somebody put on decent, very, very honest headphones, so probably not Beats. They might hear this on the piano, so I just backed it off for that. But I wanted that feeling of, this is a really honest, simple, direct recording of a piano. That's it. That's all that happens to this. There was a little bit of a boost here to make sure that that run was picked up. The piano tends to be just playing the same things over and over again, as is so common in modern construction, which is a shame. But then there is this lovely little moment where suddenly there's detail. There probably could be detail in a few other places of this, and it would benefit the track. But this detail I did not want to be missed, because it's a lovely moment. So a little bit of boost there. It helps with the piano overall. It helps focus it through, because that's below where I'm pushing most of the vocals through. So that gives it a nice cut. There's a whisker of reducing some of that low mids, and also whisker of reducing the high highs, because we want this piano to be warm. We don't want it to sound like a sample. Okay, everyone knows it is, but we don't want it to sound like one. We then have this, I renamed it as Piano Wash, which is a piano which is processed. Some of it's pre-processed, like some of it's in stereo, some of it's in mono. Reasons adaptable. But it's prone to being forward and then backwards and then forwards. Again, has to sit inside the mix. A lot of people may not notice it, but there is that point where it just brings this sense of movement shifting, of changing dimension. And we need to change dimension to accept this song. So gave it a little bit of the old tube just to make it sparkle in the rain. That rolls off some of our unnecessary low end, because this is not a bass instrument. This is sort of mid. We want all of this to happen in the mids. And we allow the drive, what little there is, to be a little asymmetric, so it can be a bit exciting. I then said, this is a processed piano sound. It needs to scream, I am a processed piano sound. So what's one of the best ways of doing that? Grain. Oh, that actually appears to be a... I think it just said ambience on this track, but that's actually a guitar thing. But either way, I decided this line would all be quite processed. Processed piano being an actual term for a type of piano. So chorusing and what have you, and this is using that grain style of chorus and an echo. And you'll hear how that has a feeling of lifting up a little bit. Some of that is because of this. Yeah, when that goes in, it seems to lift. It's because of the old trick of, with our EQ, which is basically just a kind of a bandpass type thing. If we put it in the middle, it sort of stays in the center. If we put it low, it makes the sound seem to bore If we put it on the high, then it makes the sound seem to lift, and we want that to lift. It's very subtle, but people will feel that, and that's the whole idea of this sound. So that's that. That is all our main sounds. So I had a mix that was working really nicely, but we just didn't have these. Now I could still hear them, but they were very low in the mix because I never wanted this track to be about drums and bass. It's just not that kind of track. So we come to the rhythm section. Now, there had always been some issues with drums. The focus had always been on writing the song and kind of like, well, I don't know how to do drums, so I just used this Rex loop. And that may have brought in some problems. A skilled fellow, say like Giles Reeves, pointed out that there may be some timing inconsistencies between the rhythm of his drum loop and the rhythm of his piece. I'm not going to say that Salig's wrong because he's a drummer, and if he says it's wrong, he probably is wrong. But I don't feel it. So it's not fatal. But I did have some problems with how this drum set was interacting with the track. I particularly hated the snare. I really had some issues with the snare. If this is supposed to be sort of just a really laid-back jazz type timekeeper with a brush kit, then our brushes seem to be foreshortened and cut off, which Giles was also saying, and he's right. They're a brush kit. They're sort of always moving. There isn't that sort of smack, let's wait half an hour before we go smack again. This isn't rock. Is a constant sort of where we're constantly rubbing and moving the kit. It's a different style of playing. How they do it, I don't know, but I don't know how anybody plays a normal kit. Freaky stuff. So I kept thinking, how do I do that? Initially, I went in and trying to change that snare with EQ. There was a kind of heavy-handed EQ on this kit as it was, and I think that he was trying to solve some problems or feeling like it wasn't right. But we had this funny, flat, papery, pancakey kind of a snare. And then I remembered that in Dr. Octarex, and I never used it, or virtually never used this, that you can actually go through, find the slice. So I found the two slices, 3 and 9, where the snare was, and pulled the level back, and that helped a lot. That it still hadn't quite got it, and then I was like, oh, hang on, I can change the filter frequency. I didn't want this kit to sound filtered, absolutely not, but I wanted to get that snare in a different place, and I didn't want to have to mess around with sub-arts and this, that, and the other. I could have, but did not want to. If I can solve it in-house, in the one box, whilst keeping them in the one room, then that to me is the better solution. So actually closing down the filter a bit, where that's moved to for this slice, I don't know, but that combination of reducing the volume and doing that is far more realistic to this kind of performance than whoever this player is who's just gone whack. That's how I felt this song wanted this drum performance to feel. That it's a smooth groove, not a boom, boom. It's not Slade. So that I think has solved a lot of the drum issue, and it's allowed the brushes to come forward far better. I've also done my pretty regular trick of using Echo Bode. So this is a frequency shifter, not a pitch shifter, a frequency shifter. With small amounts, it sounds similar, and then it does this. Brilliant. But with tiny amounts, that moved the spectral thing whilst not messing around with FFT spectral processing, which I don't like. I was just bloody well auto-tune everything. There's an LFO inbuilt, which is moving fairly slowly, little bit of shift, and then another LFO that's moving even slower. put the two together, we don't have a regular sine wave. We've got a pair of probably sine waves, and their interaction means that they will constantly be sort of moving like this. And that means that it's hard for us to pick the pattern. If we can pick the pattern, we can start ignoring the drums. This has a pattern that's hard for us to pick, and it makes that kit seem as though there is a lot more movement. There are some oddities in that he doesn't necessarily play all of the parts of the loop, so that might explain why sometimes the brush that's going around just kind of does this. But so what? I don't really care. A lot of this performance has been copy and pasted together. It's the end of what we hear as the song that counts, and I think this makes it organic. Popped it through tube. I don't love that it's made the kick longer, but in this case it's not a problem. We've allowed all the bottom end through, a little bit of asymmetry, and so that gives us a nice authentic-ish drum sound. And the fact that we've used tube in a few other places, like with our nice, wonderfully microphoned piano, we've got a little bit of tube in there. We've got a common sense of, oh, okay, this has probably been recorded in the same room with the same mics. Nobody's going to think that, but there's that sense of feeling of togetherness in how these sounds have been created. This is why, while it is done, this is why a band who want to have a together-sounding record will tend not to fly to Nassau to record the drums and then fly to Motown to record the bass and then fly off to Sydney to record a piano, because chances are it's going to be much harder to fit together. It does happen, but when you want that really consistent sound, then you're probably going to say, let's record all of or a lot of this song in the one place, because that way we've got consistency in the room sound, the sound of the microphones, the decisions that the engineer has made. If everything doesn't match, we can end up with that exploded feel. So this helps pull that together. The bass was put through a bass amp, Soft Tube's bass amp that comes with this. Turned it straight off to have a listen to what we had. Where's our bass? Bass. How low can we go? And it's a nice sound. It's just a bass. I'm not sure what it is. I mean, maybe it's a Yamaha. Who cares? I don't think it's a P bass. Don't really know. Don't really care. But it's a nice sound, and it had been just kind of brutalized. It's like somebody had, he'd I don't know, watched how to mix to sound like something or other, Mastodon or something. I'm just making this up, and then applied that because I didn't really know how to cab something, and that's fair enough. Amping and cabbing guitars is actually quite an art, one that I've been on a journey of discovery of my own, and also talking to Jake, my pet guitarist, about some of these things, and he's very easy come, easy go about how these things are done. He's not sort of like, you must this and Celestian and this, that, and the other. He's very sort of like, yeah, whatever. As long as it sounds good. He'll tell me if he doesn't like it. But you might have made it bassier, but you got rid of all the character. And the interesting thing about the fact that you've got the sort of jazzy brush thing and a bass that actually has a fair amount of character up top, then to get collectively, they start to sound a little bit like a stand-up double bass. Boom, 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 boom. The performance is not like that, but it sounds a bit that way. So back to our tube, because I want to bring out some of where he'd hacked this out, like hacked this out, and turned up the bass. I've kept the bass where it is. It's fine, it's natural. This is not rap. It's not hip hop that needs to have a, 300 dB of sub bass. It's about feel. It's about the groove. And so kept that bass quite natural. What he's chopped out, I've actually put back in. That's a nice sound. Pulled a little bit of presence in the 1K, because we know that the 1K is prone to being pulled out in almost everything else. So it gives us a nice place that we can just sort of put a little bit of edge on the top of the bass and then rolled off the high end. We don't want that interfering with anything else. I don't think there was anything there anyway, but we just don't want it interfering. Didn't bother again with cabs. I could have, but I didn't feel like it needed it. So if I didn't feel like it needed it, I would have just been applying it for ego. Ooh, look, I put a cab on it. It didn't need it, so I left it off. And then it goes through, like there's no compression here. There was compression and what have you. On the original, there's obviously going to be a little bit of compression just through the saturation of the tube, and same here. But I deliberately left it just for the bus. So we've got this real natural feeling of the rhythm section being together in the room, and the room is making a move together. So hear how that's kind of flat? It's like, yeah, it's all right, it's all correct, but it doesn't, we don't come over all Barry White. Just that little bit, really a dB of control and movement. Helps control some of the length of that kick drum, which has gotten a little longer than I'd like it to be. Relatively slow attack, relatively slow release. We're just looking for that movement, and done the usual way of stupid low threshold, pretty high ratio, find where it grooves, and that's it. Now you'll notice, automation, Benedict automated. In the mix, there's mostly drums and bass go with piano. So they're locked in together. But then there's this bit where they don't.
I would love to ask you so many things, but it's getting cold, like way back in the...
If you're listening just to the drums and bass, you're going to go, oh, well, of course we need them there. But, hello. The reality is they start to detract from the vocal and the story that's being told. So I just move these back by, well, not even 2 dB. At this point,
I would love to ask you so...
Because in the overall sense of the mix and just the natural masking and sense of gluing together that happens with a mix, once that piano and its low end disappears, then the drums, and particularly the bass, are just moving in to fill the space. They're going, woohoo, look at me, show off. But the problem is they then suddenly seem to get louder and the balance is gone. So pull them back a little bit there. And I was pretty sure when I was thinking about it that there was another point where it did it. So I went and put it here and then realized, oh, hang on, the piano's still in the mix. But you know what? I prefer it that way. We've got this vocal here, remember this part that's starting to lift off?
Everything went this way, and if you sometimes would love to go back.
By pulling out, particularly the bass at that point, we make the track seem to start to lift. Heavy bass, so heavy drums, heavy bass, ground a piece. And that's fine if that's what you're looking for. But if you're looking for light and airy, you don't want to have a lot of because it's just like bolting someone to the floor. So here, seeing I'd done that already and it was there, it was like, yep, that's actually the right decision to have that there. So back of the old noggin is far smarter than the front of the old noggin. It told me it wanted it there. And it wanted it for a very darn good reason, because once I A-B'd that, it's like, yeah, no, it's better. You don't notice that it backs off, but it helps that piece to just lift off, to come a little unglued from reality, which is superb because it plays to what the vocal's trying to do, or is doing. It really is doing. That's all our parts, our drums, our bass, our everything. So then it was just a case of going over, listening to the material,
Can't stay.
and thinking, do they all fit together? So that's where I've explained some of those changes and what's happening. And yes, they do. It's rare that I do much in changes here. There can be little alterations, but very rare in changes. I questioned, did I have these bits right?
And if you sometimes would love to go back and stay.
The question was, are they going to be not loud enough? No, I think they're great. You don't fully hear this, but you feel it as all part of that lift. And this is very nice. It's got that, I'm prepared to really be subtle and hide down the bottom. And again with this, just that when the track starts, we've got those backwards piano, I think it is here, that just very subtly underneath the mix, providing us with that sense of something's coming. We're moving outside of reality in some way. So it's unusual not to hammer in with the lead vocal. You know, went down to Santa Fe where Renoir paints the wall. Oh, sorry, that's the Angels. But to come in with an ooh, in which case we want to make that work. So the ooh doesn't want to be dominant. It'd be easy to say, oh, well, let's make the oohs loud. No, we still want the piano and those guitars to actually own the space, but the oohs will fill the space. And that's a big difference. You turn it up loud to go, oh, now they own the space. No, they are not meant to own the space. We want our main sort of rhythm section, which is our guitars, piano, and then drums and bass, to own this space, to define what's happening. And then those oohs are a little on the quiet side, but because there is space there, they just fill it out. And that's exactly what they're designed to do. So that was it. The last change really was the fret noise in the electrics that I talked about before, just pulling them out in the mids, and going and listening in the lounge in particular, I heard breath noises which just weren't as aggressively debreathified as I felt were necessary. So I went through and did them. There was a click in, I don't know, this or something, but I just could not get rid of it without making it worse. So it's better to stay there. So again, if you've got a clicky mouth, it commonly means dehydration. So that means you're not drinking enough water. If you've just drunk water, you don't sing for a while. You've got to let the water be out of your mouth. But drink more water overall. Hydrate better. Don't smoke. Don't drink Coke. Don't drink coffee. Definitely don't toke, because they all dry you out. If you are going to do those things, drink lots of water so you are well hydrated overall, and you'll reduce the clicks and pops that come from mouths. Then it just comes down to the mastering. So we can get rid of that, F6. Now we're in our rack, and it comes to the, I had a mix which sounded like, actually we won't bypass that, we'll just bypass these, and we'll leave our main limiter on. Limiter's always on for me, not to mix into if I see stuff happening, woo, wrong, but just in case something exciting comes through, it's not going to hit my nice yamos. Quiet, really quiet. Not at all uncommon for me. I like to work quiet, and I like to make quiet mixes. I like that feeling of expansiveness. No OTTing the buggery out of this, because it's just going to wreck it. You're not going to have this beautiful feeling that you can come into. You're just going to have this, well, vanilla sausage brick. This is not a vanilla sausage brick song. It's not Greta Van Fleet or whoever. So the first thing I do is to pull this up to a mixable or a masterable level. And that is to push this, and we'll move to the louder part of the song. That'll do. So I'm wanting to see my RMS at 12, not really above it. Depends how loud the song is overall. You know, is it, in which case, yeah, I might go a little higher than 12, and I want my peaks to be about here, just naturally there. That's the right level. That means I'm feeding all my processors a nice level. I could do it with this, but I'd rather do it with this. So that way, if something happens and I change this out, my settings don't have to be redone, and plus 12 dB on this device may not be the same as plus 12 dB on another device. Reason stuff tends to be pretty consistent, but a lot of VST are very inconsistent. That's part of how they pretend to be analog. Sneaky, sneaky. So I'm getting the main level for, okay, this is where it is for radio or album. I think this is more an album cut than a radio single, just because radio won't play this kind of stuff. Screw you, radio, narrow-minded bunch of... Anyway, compression. Compression is done my usual way. I start, and I am not looking to control levels here. Compression is not about controlling levels in this instance at all. I start real heavy-handed, and I'm moving these. Feel how that drum rhythm now feels good. Yeah, the rest of the piece sounds terrible, but that's not what it's about when you're doing this. You're finding your points by finding the point where this just gets a nice groove. What that groove is going to be is going to depend on what the piece is. Here, the piece has got this nice that rolls through it with the drums and the bass. That's cool. So that's come straight up there. If it was a disco piece, we'd be looking for the compression shape, which gave us a kind of a thing. So you've just got to balance between attack and release. The faster the song, generally the faster the attack might need to be, and possibly the longer the release needs to be, but it all comes down to what you're looking for when you've hit that point where it's like, that just really is the essence of the groove. We ignore how it sounds, we just go with how it feels. Then we back this off, and back this off. Do you think of me? I never compress at this point more than 2 to 1. Sometimes, occasionally, I'll be at 1.5. And then if I might sort of push a little harder. And I want this just flashing. I am not looking to dig holes in this. When the autumn seems to arrive. Just sounds horrid. It might sound very hipster, but it sounds horrid. Because we've just crushed the life out of this piece. It might be louder. We might be able to turn it up another 48 dB. But it doesn't sound nice. It just sounds crushed. And this is about this kind of expansive Days of Future Past feel. It's a fantasy, a reverie. And it has to be lovely and spotty and expansive. So the last thing we want to do is anything more than just a slight move. Then I'll go with tape, like this. I don't use the compression much on this at all. I'm not looking for a radical change in anything here. If I'm at my master's and I'm looking for a radical change, I have got it wrong. And I know that, so I'm never at my master's looking for a radical change. Or if I come back thinking, you know what, I think I need a radical change, this is killed, and I go back to where I can make a radical change and where I should make a radical change. This whole idea of, oh, look, you can get this EQ that splits your signal into 48 different variants, and this part of the EQ is your bass drum, and this part of the EQ is your backing vocals. F off. That's just wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. Those tools might be interesting if you want to do weird-ass sound design that sounds like you auto-tuned everything, but you're not learning your craft at its core. And your craft at your core is to know what gets done where, because then it's very effective. And as you see, you can make tiny movements and have this seemingly big results. So we get a nice... It adds a sheen, a kind of air to this. It's a je ne sais quoi, but it's well worth it. Then add an EQ. I like using this fella for this.
Do you think of me when the autumn?
Get rid of the low end. If it was a louder, raunchier song, I would probably be up at about 35, maybe slightly higher on the roll-off, but I'm happy to let the bass extend a bit further in this. Oddly enough, I've given a little bit of a boost here. That was the last thing done. So the first thing was considering whether to roll off the tops, but this is quite a warm mix for me, so I decided to leave them in. And then air. Very tiny. I'm not looking to fix problems. I'm just looking to say, can I bring a little bit more sparkle in here? So a tiny bit of air. It's on the low side for air, but it is air. And that tiny bit, I feel, just gives a nice little thing. I don't want this to be super bright. I know, it's a Benedict mix, and I don't want it to be super bright. This is a bit thick. So I've pulled it back. Again, just a small amount. A lot of the sounds are tubby in the tummy. The original fellow was fully aware of that. He was trying to pull it out all over the place. This just, across the board, unmasks that a little bit, which helps clarify these things.
When the autumn seems to arrive.
And that allowed me plenty of space to say, let's give a tiny, tiny goose on the 60. So... let it. Harder to hear in these headphones, but on the speakers I hear it quite clearly. It just gives this little sense of air and rise. Not this, let's push as much clarity out of this ozone as we can, because we end up with these skewed, tilted mixes. But just to say we've got this lovely warm mix, let's just give it a little bit of this sense of air and sparkle around it. I then just move to get the right overall level in the end. And I could push this harder, but then we start to... And, okay... If this were going on FM radio, then I might push it a little harder, but I know that FM radio are going to push it themselves. They're going to have their whole process. But FM radio's process for processing this, talking about old-fashioned FM radio from the 80s, their process was very nice. In terms of going, I need to turn this up another 48 dB so that it's blamming on Spotify when somebody comes out of listening to the latest Opeth song. It's like, yeah, no. Let's just give this as much freedom as possible. If somebody wants to do another mix for that, brilliant, they can go for it, but that's not going to be the target for this. This would be like it was going on the album or something. I'd love to hear this on the radio. I really would. It would be so much nicer to be able to turn on the radio and hear this than the drivel that is there. But I just don't think it's going to be there, in which case I might as well use as much space as I can, so I'm going over easy, and in the loudest bits it only just flicks. I'm not using look ahead. My limiter I could leave off. I'm really soft clipping. Because when you use a limiter, you actually hear it start to punch down, and it starts to trap the track. Don't want that. Whereas your soft clip can just disappear a few dB whilst actually brightening the track at the same time. Then just the minus 0.3 of a dB, so that we shouldn't have any overs coming out of anywhere at all. And that is it. I proved this.
Autumn seems to arrive. Do you think
go to print with this. And that's what you heard at the beginning. I know this is long. We're almost 2 hours in, but hopefully at the same time there's a greater understanding in how to do this stuff yourself. Because if you are going to do it yourself, I'd rather see you do it right for your material than try to follow someone's, you must do this or you're not pro enough, and make a mess of your material, which means that people actually can't get into it. A few people in forums will say, oh, you followed the perfect tut for this. But F off, they're not going to buy your stuff. They're only interested in proving how pro they are. You need to find fans, people who are going around, wandering around, going, oh, if only I could hear somebody who is as cool as James Taylor, or, I don't know, French fellow F.R. David. Words. How good would my day be? Stumble on this kind of thing when it's nicely mixed. As in, it's mixed to tell the story, not to prove proness, then even if it's not perfect, there are plenty of great records that are far from perfect, bad out of hell, far from perfect, but what a hell of a record. Then the person will engage with it because the story is what matters, and they're likely to then lob up on that Bandcamp of yours, link below, to say, you know what, I like this, I'm going to buy that record and put it on at home. And that's how you get fans. If you have any questions, polite questions, ask them on down below. If you would like to hire me to do work for you, because this is how I make my living, this is my day job, I do these pro bono every now and then when I particularly like the track and feel like I can help solve a broader problem that I see plenty of people having, then I'll do these occasionally. But if you want to hire me, there will also be a link down below. You have a great day now.